I never thought the day would come when my own blood would turn against me. At 60 years old, after a lifetime of working, providing, and doing everything I could for my family, I found myself standing in the driveway of my daughter's suburban house in Dallas, Texas, staring at my belongings piled like trash beside the curb. The sun was setting, casting a long shadow over the heap of cardboard boxes, old clothes, and framed photographs. Photographs that once hung proudly on the walls of their living room were now discarded like they meant nothing. "Dad, this isn't working anymore," my son-in-law Mark had said just minutes earlier, his voice sharp and unyielding. My daughter, Emily, stood beside him, her arms crossed, eyes refusing to meet mine. My granddaughter, Lily, peeked out from behind the curtains, her small face pressed to the glass, confusion written all over her innocent expression. It was like my chest caved in. My breath caught. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to remind them of all the nights I had stayed awake so Emily could finish her homework, all the weekends I gave up fishing trips to fix her bike, all the sacrifices I made so she could have a better life. But no words came out, just silence, a silence heavier than any argument. I tried to carry myself with dignity as they shut the door in my face. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in my ears. It was final. I was no longer welcome. Neighbors walked by, some whispering, others pretending not to see. To them, I was just another old man cast aside by his family, another story they would gossip about over dinner. Shame burned through me hotter than the Texas summer heat. I spent that night on a worn-out park bench 2 blocks away. The wooden slats dug into my back, and the air smelled of cut grass mixed with gasoline from passing cars. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and stared up at the stars. I used to tell Lily stories about constellations, how Orion chased the Pleiades across the night sky. But that night, the stars felt distant, unreachable, mocking me with their cold indifference. By the second day, hunger gnawed at my stomach. I had $20 in my pocket, just enough for coffee and a sandwich at a dingy diner near the highway. The waitress, a woman about my age with tired eyes and a name tag that read Carol, gave me a look of pity. I hated that look. It reminded me that I was no longer the man I used to be, the strong father, the dependable provider. I was just another forgotten old man with nowhere to go. On the third day, as I sat outside the diner, staring at the road stretching endlessly ahead, something inside me snapped. A quiet, burning determination sparked in my chest. If they thought they could throw me out and erase me from their lives, they were wrong. I wasn't finished. Not yet. I straightened my back, clenched my fists, and whispered to myself, "They'll regret this. They'll see who I really am." And that was the moment my story truly began. The morning of the third day greeted me with the rumble of garbage trucks and the smell of stale coffee still clinging to my shirt. I sat outside the diner, watching life move on without me. Families passed by in shiny SUVs, kids bickering in the back seat, while I sat there with 20 crumpled dollars and no place to call home. I thought about Emily again, my daughter, my pride, the reason I had pushed through every hardship in my life. How could she shut the door on me so easily? I tried to convince myself it was Mark's doing, that maybe he had poisoned her against me, convinced her that I was just a burden. But a darker thought lingered. What if she truly believed I was worthless? The weight of that thought pressed down on my chest. By noon, the hunger returned, sharp and relentless. I wandered through a strip mall, searching for somewhere cheap enough to stretch my last few dollars. That's when I noticed the help wanted sign taped to the window of a hardware store. My hands, calloused and worn from decades of construction work, twitched at the thought. Maybe I wasn't finished after all. Inside, the air smelled of lumber and oil. A man in his 40s, stocky and bald, looked me up and down. His name tag read Ron. "You looking for work?" he asked, skepticism dripping from his voice. "Yes, sir," I replied. "I've been in construction my whole life. Roofing, carpentry, you name it. I can still pull my weight." Ron studied me for a moment, then shrugged. "It's part-time, unloading shipments and stocking shelves. Pay isn't much. You sure you can handle it?" I almost laughed. After everything, a little heavy lifting was nothing. "I can handle it," I said firmly. That evening, I walked out of the hardware store with a small advance in my pocket and a promise of more hours if I proved myself. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a thread of dignity I could cling to. As I bought a cheap meal, and tucked it into a paper bag. I caught my reflection in the window of the diner. The man staring back at me looked older than I remembered, gray hair tangled, face lined with exhaustion. But behind those tired eyes, I saw something new: resolve. I wasn't going to be the man they threw away. I wasn't going to let Emily remember me as a failure, or let Lily grow up thinking her grandfather was too weak to fight for himself. That night, as I lay on the bench again, the stars above no longer mocked me. Instead, they felt like witnesses, silent and distant, but watching. I whispered into the darkness, "You kicked me out, but I'm not gone. Not yet. Just give me time." And as the night breeze rustled through the trees, I felt the first fragile spark of hope begin to grow into something stronger, something dangerous. The hardware store became my refuge. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay barely covered meals, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in days: purpose. Every morning I showed up before sunrise, long before Ron even unlocked the doors. The smell of fresh lumber and motor oil reminded me of construction sites from my younger years, when my body was strong, my back unbroken by time, and my hands steady with a hammer. Unloading shipments was grueling work. My arms ached, my knees threatened to give out, but I refused to show weakness. I stacked boxes higher than the younger guys and worked until sweat dripped into my eyes. Ron noticed. "You're tougher than you look, old man," he muttered one afternoon, tossing me a cold soda. It wasn't much, but in his own way, it was respect. And respect was something I hadn't tasted in far too long. On the fourth evening of my exile, I sat on the curb outside the store, sipping that soda, when a voice broke the silence. "You always work this hard, or are you trying to impress someone?" I turned and saw her, a woman about my age, silver streaks in her brown hair, wearing a grocery apron. She held a paper bag in her hands and smiled in a way that didn't feel like pity. "Name's Margaret," she said, handing me the bag. "I work over at the market next door. Figured you could use a hot meal. You look like someone who's forgotten how to take a break." Inside the bag was a roasted chicken leg, mashed potatoes, and a slice of apple pie. The smell alone nearly brought me to tears. For 3 days I had lived on cold sandwiches and burnt coffee. Now, someone cared enough to offer me real food. "Thank you," I said quietly, unsure if my voice would crack. Margaret sat beside me on the curb, watching cars pass. "You got family around here?" I hesitated. The words were bitter in my mouth. I did, but they decided they didn't need me anymore. She didn't press, didn't ask for details. She just nodded like she understood, like she knew what it was to be cast aside. "Families can be crueler than strangers sometimes," she said. We ate in silence after that, and for the first time in days, the knot in my chest loosened. I wasn't completely alone. The following mornings, Margaret would wave when I arrived at the store, sometimes slipping me leftovers from the market. Each gesture chipped away at the despair I had been drowning in. But while I appreciated her kindness, a storm still brewed inside me. Every night, as I lay on that same park bench, I pictured Emily's face, the way she looked through me as if I were already dead. I thought about Lily's confused eyes behind that curtain. No, this wasn't how my story would end. With every crate I lifted, every box I stacked, I felt strength returning. A plan was forming, piece by piece. Like a foundation, I was laying brick by brick. They had thrown me away, but soon, they would see just how wrong they were. By the end of my first full week at the hardware store, I had managed to save just over $100. It wasn't much, but after nights of counting quarters and dimes like they were gold coins, it felt like a fortune. I refused to spend a single penny recklessly. Every cup of coffee, every sandwich, I weighed carefully. Ron, the manager, must have noticed my situation. One evening, after we finished unloading a truck, he leaned on the counter and asked, "You still sleeping on that bench?" I froze. I hadn't told him, but I guess he figured it out. I nodded stiffly. He scratched his bald head and sighed. "Look, there's a guy I know. Owns a small motel down by the highway. Place ain't fancy, but he rents by the week. Tell him I sent you. He'll cut you a deal." The following day, I walked into that rundown motel. The neon sign outside flickered VAC and CY, like it was barely hanging on. The manager, a wiry man named Hank, sized me up. "Ron said you need a place?" I handed him my cash, every dollar I had saved, and in return he gave me a room key. Room 6. The paint was peeling, the mattress sagged in the middle, but to me it was a palace. For the first time in nearly a week, I shut a door behind me and felt safe. That night, I lay in that lumpy bed and stared at the ceiling fan creaking above. My body ached, but my heart felt lighter. No one could throw me out of here. Not yet, at least. Over the next days, I fell into a rhythm. Work at the store, quick dinners from Margaret's Market, and nights spent in my motel room planning. I bought a small notebook with the few spare dollars I had left and began writing things down. Expenses, goals, even scattered thoughts. Save $200 more by the end of the month. Find better housing after. Call a lawyer someday. Maybe there's a way to fight back legally. Writing those words gave me direction. Each line on the page was a promise to myself that I wouldn't fade away quietly. Margaret noticed the change in me. One evening, she brought me a thermos of soup and said, "You're walking straighter these days. Like you've got something to prove." I smiled faintly. Maybe I do. But even as the small victories piled up, a roof over my head, steady work, the kindness of a stranger, the wound inside me never closed. Every time I looked at my notebook, I thought about Emily and Lily. My daughter had chosen her husband's voice over mine, and my granddaughter was growing up thinking her grandfather had simply vanished. I couldn't let that be the ending. And so, as I clicked off the motel lamp and closed my notebook one night, I whispered to myself again, just as I had under the stars. They'll regret this. Just wait. The days rolled into weeks, and for the first time in a long while, I stopped counting hours by the ache in my stomach. My paycheck wasn't large, but it was steady, and steady meant survival. After rent at the motel, I had just enough left for groceries and the occasional hot meal at the diner. Ron kept testing me with heavier loads and longer hours. At first, I thought he was trying to push me out, but then I realized he was watching, waiting to see if I'd break. When I didn't, his gruff attitude softened. "You know, old man," he said one Friday, "you work harder than half these kids. Thinking about giving you a raise, 50 cents more an hour." 50 cents. Most people would laugh at the thought. But to me, it felt like recognition, a sign that I wasn't invisible. Margaret celebrated the news by bringing me a fresh loaf of bread and a jar of her homemade jam. She insisted I take it. "A man can't rebuild himself on canned soup alone," she said with a wink. It was small gestures like that which reminded me I still had worth. People who didn't know my past, who hadn't judged me, could see value in me. That realization lit something inside I hadn't felt since Emily was a child: pride. On weekends, when I wasn't working, I started walking around the neighborhood. I'd fix little things for people, a broken fence here, a squeaky door there. At first, I refused payment, but neighbors began slipping me a few dollars or leaving a bag of groceries at my door. Word spread quickly. The handyman at the motel. One afternoon, a young single mother named Claire stopped me outside the market. Her son's bike had a busted chain. I knelt down on the sidewalk, grease staining my fingers, and within minutes had it good as new. The boy's smile nearly broke me. For a moment, I remembered Emily at that age, running to me with her own broken bike, trusting that Dad could fix anything. That night, alone in my motel room, I stared at the boy's gratitude still echoing in my mind. It hurt, but it also healed something small inside me. Maybe I couldn't change the past, but I could prove, to myself, to the world, that I still mattered. Yet every victory carried its shadow. Each time someone thanked me, I thought of Emily's cold eyes, of Mark's sneer. They had reduced me to nothing in their minds, but here I was, piece by piece, rising again. And with each dollar saved, each kind word earned, the fire inside me burned hotter. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about redemption. And maybe, just maybe, revenge. By the end of my second month at the hardware store, my savings had grown thicker than the thin envelope I kept them in. It wasn't much by most standards, just under $600. But to me, it felt like an empire in the making. Every bill folded crisp and neat reminded me that I was not finished. Ron noticed the change. "You're not dragging your feet anymore," he said one morning as we lifted lumber together. "You're working like a man with something to prove." I didn't deny it. Maybe I am. In truth, every box I carried was one step away from the humiliation of being thrown out. Every paycheck was another brick in the wall I was building between the man they thought they'd destroyed and the man I was becoming. Margaret was the only one I allowed to see the softer side of me. She'd stop by the motel sometimes, dropping off leftover stew or homemade cookies. We'd sit on the steps, sharing stories about the past. She told me about her husband who had passed 5 years earlier, and how her children lived in other states, too busy to visit. Her loneliness mirrored my own, but she wore it with quiet grace. "You've still got life in you," she said one evening, her eyes fixed on the glowing motel sign. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words stuck. I wrote them in my notebook that night, underlined twice. With every dollar saved, my thoughts turned more and more toward Emily. I pictured her sitting at her kitchen table, laughing with Mark, while Lily played on the floor. Did she ever think of me? Did she regret it, even for a second? Or was I already erased, as if I had never been a part of their lives? The questions gnawed at me, but instead of dragging me down, they sharpened my resolve. If she wanted me gone, then one day she would see just how wrong she was. Not through anger or shouting, no. That wasn't my way. I wanted her to see me standing tall again, successful, strong. I wanted her to regret the moment she chose to close that door in my face. And so, the notebook filled with plans. Not vague dreams, but concrete steps. Save $1,500. Move out of motel into proper apartment. Expand handyman work into side income. Find lawyer. Check property rights and inheritance options. Build presence in community. Connections matter. Each bullet point was a roadmap. Each night, when I shut off the buzzing motel lamp, I whispered a promise. This isn't the end. This is the beginning. By the third month, I was no longer just surviving. I was building. The fire inside me had shifted from a flicker of survival to a roaring blaze of determination. And though Emily didn't know it yet, my return to her life was inevitable. By the start of my third month at the motel, people in the neighborhood began to recognize me not as the old guy from the hardware store, but as someone they could depend on. Word spread quickly. I fixed leaky faucets, patched fences, mended steps, and even rewired a few faulty light fixtures. I never charged much, just enough to cover my expenses, but neighbors insisted on paying more. Some pressed cash into my hand, others left groceries at my door. The respect I had lost under Emily's roof was slowly returning, not from family, but from strangers. And somehow, that meant even more. One evening, while repairing a porch railing for an older gentleman named Frank, he watched me work with a curious eye. "You've got good hands," he said, his voice gravelly. "Not many men your age still keep their craft." I shrugged. Hands don't forget what they've been trained to do. Frank chuckled. "You remind me of myself when I was still practicing law, always fixing things no one else bothered with." That word, law, caught my attention. "You were a lawyer?" "Retired now," he said. "But 35 years in family law teaches you a thing or two about people and about betrayal." His words cut through me. Without meaning to, I told him my story in fragments. Not the whole shame, but enough. My daughter, the eviction, the belongings tossed in the trash. His eyes narrowed as he listened. "You ever consider that you might still have rights?" Frank asked when I finished. Family law isn't simple, but abandonment of a parent, especially when there are grandchildren involved. Well, let's just say I've seen cases where the law sided with the blood that was cast aside. I stared at him, my chest tightening. "You think there's something I can do?" Frank nodded slowly. "You can't erase what happened, but you can make sure they know you're not invisible. Sometimes, the law is less about winning and more about being heard." That night, as I returned to the motel with Frank's card in my pocket, I felt something shift. Until now, my plan had been about survival, about piecing together dignity from scraps. But Frank had opened a new door, the possibility of fighting back through the system itself. Margaret noticed the difference in me the next day when she handed me a bag of groceries. "You're standing taller again," she said with a small smile. "Maybe I finally know which way I'm going," I replied. I wasn't just patching fences anymore. I was building a case, a life, a reputation, and maybe even a legacy. Emily thought she had erased me with one slammed door. But soon, she would see I was not a man to be thrown away. And this time, I wouldn't just whisper my promise to the stars. I would carve it into the very ground beneath my feet. Frank invited me to his house a week later. It was a modest place, lined with bookshelves sagging under the weight of dusty law volumes. He poured us both a cup of black coffee and slid a yellow legal pad across the table. "Let's start with the basics," he said. "Tell me everything, from the day you moved into your daughter's house to the moment they pushed you out." I hesitated, shame twisting in my gut, but Frank's steady gaze held me. I spoke slowly at first, then faster, spilling years of memories. The move into Emily's house after my wife passed, how I tried to help with Lily, how Mark grew colder with each passing month, until one evening my suitcase and boxes were dumped at the curb. Frank scribbled notes, nodding occasionally. When I finished, silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator. "You have more standing than you think," he said finally. "Texas law doesn't look kindly on abandoning an elderly parent without cause, especially when there's clear financial exploitation involved. You told me you contributed to bills, groceries, and home repairs." I blinked. "But it's family. Doesn't that change everything?" Frank's voice hardened. "It changes nothing. Blood isn't a license for cruelty." The words lodged in my chest. For the first time, I felt like someone had given me permission to feel wronged, truly wronged, not just ashamed. Frank explained the costs, too. Filing paperwork, consultations, possibly even court appearances. It wasn't cheap. I would need at least $2,000 to start. That night, back at the motel, I opened my notebook and rewrote my goals. Save $2,000. Hire Frank. Take back my voice. From that day forward, every extra job I took, every fence I fixed, wasn't just survival. It was fuel for the fight ahead. Neighbors began to rely on me more than ever. Claire, the young mother, called me when her water heater broke. Mrs. Thompson down the street trusted me to patch her roof after a storm. Ron even let me take old tools from the hardware store at a discount, knowing I used them for side jobs. One evening, Margaret came by the motel carrying a bundle of freshly washed clothes. "You can't keep working like a mule in those rags," she said firmly. I tried to protest, but she shushed me. "Take them. Consider it an investment in your comeback." Her kindness nearly undid me. "Margaret," I whispered, "why are you doing all this?" She looked me in the eye. "Because someone once did it for me when I had nothing. And because you're worth saving, even if your own family forgot that." Those words burned hotter than any insult Mark had ever thrown at me. They reminded me that I wasn't invisible. By the end of that month, my savings had crossed $1,200. Each bill was a step closer to standing tall again, not as a forgotten grandfather, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. And though Emily still didn't know it, her choice to cast me aside had set something in motion. Something irreversible. By the start of the fourth month, my envelope of savings had grown thicker than ever. When I counted it one quiet evening at the motel, my hands trembled. $1,960. Just 40 short of the goal Frank had set. I stared at the stack of bills for a long time, my heart pounding. Each crease and smudge on those notes carried the sweat of my labor, the ache of my back, and the fire of my determination. The motel no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a base, a place to regroup, plan, and wait for the right moment. My notebook now held more than just lists of expenses. It had sketches of ideas, fragments of speeches I might one day say in court, even letters I'd never send to Emily. Letters filled with words she needed to hear, words that burned in my chest. "You turned your back on me, Emily. But one day, you'll see me again, and you won't recognize the man you tried to erase." One Saturday morning, as I repaired the steps on Mrs. Thompson's porch, she leaned against the railing and casually mentioned something that froze me in place. "I saw your daughter at the grocery store last week," she said, not realizing how each word pierced me. "Looked like they were planning some kind of big party. She was with her husband, buying decorations. Balloons, fancy wine. Must be Lily's birthday coming up." The hammer in my hand stilled. My granddaughter's birthday. The thought of Lily laughing, blowing out candles, surrounded by family while I sat alone in a dingy motel. It was almost too much to bear. My throat tightened, my eyes stung, but I forced myself to keep driving nails into the wood. When I returned to the motel that evening, Margaret found me sitting outside, staring at the horizon. She set down a paper bag of groceries and studied my face. "What happened?" she asked gently. I told her about the birthday, about how Emily had erased me so completely that even Lily would think her grandfather no longer existed. Margaret listened, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Then that's why you can't give up," she said firmly. "Because one day, Lily will be old enough to ask questions. And when she does, she deserves to know the truth. Not their version, yours." Her words lit a fire deeper than any before. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. About making sure Lily knew her grandfather hadn't walked away, hadn't vanished. He had fought. That night, I added a new line to my notebook. Fight not just for me, but for Lily. 2 days later, I finally crossed the 2,000 mark. The envelope was heavy in my hand when I carried it to Frank's house. He looked at the stack, then at me, and for the first time, he smiled broadly. "You're ready," he said. "It's time to make them hear you." And just like that, the plan that had been simmering in silence was about to step into the light. Frank's living room smelled faintly of old leather and dust as he spread the papers across his coffee table. My $2,000 sat in an envelope between us, my lifeline, my weapon. "First step," Frank said, sliding a stack of forms toward me, "is filing a petition with the court. We'll claim wrongful eviction, abandonment, and financial exploitation. It's not going to guarantee victory, but it forces them to respond." The words "forces them to respond" hit me like a drumbeat. For months, Emily and Mark had lived as though I didn't exist. But now, they would have to look at me again, not as a shadow, but as a man who refused to stay buried. Frank guided me through the paperwork. My hands shook as I signed each page, the pen scratching across the paper like a declaration of war. Every signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When we were finished, Frank leaned back in his chair. "You need to understand something. This won't be easy. They'll fight back. They'll hire lawyers, maybe try to smear you. You have to be ready for the worst." I nodded. I've already lived the worst. I can handle whatever comes next. The petition was filed the next morning. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt both 10 feet taller and unbearably small. Part of me wanted to shout in triumph, but another part trembled at the storm I had just invited. 2 weeks later, the first response arrived. Mark had wasted no time. His lawyer filed a motion calling me a disruptive influence, a financial burden, and, the one that stung most, an unstable presence unfit to be around his granddaughter. Reading those words was like swallowing glass. My own son-in-law was painting me as a danger, twisting years of sacrifice into something ugly. That night, I couldn't sleep. The motel room felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in. I stared at the ceiling fan until dawn, my chest tight with rage. But when I saw Margaret the next morning, she touched my arm and whispered, "Don't let their lies define you." Her words reminded me of something important. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand firm. Frank reassured me, too. "It's a tactic," he said calmly, flipping through the documents. "They want to rattle you. If you lose your temper, they win. Stay steady." So I did. I worked my shifts, fixed neighbors' fences, saved every spare dollar, and wrote in my notebook late at night. Each page held reminders. I am not a burden. I am not unstable. I am a man who gave everything. Still, beneath the determination, fear lingered. What if the court believed them? What if Emily stood beside Mark and repeated his lies? Could I bear to see my daughter's mouth shape those words? The thought haunted me. But then I pictured Lily, sweet, innocent Lily, and remembered Margaret's voice. One day she'll ask questions. She deserves the truth. That was enough to keep me moving forward. And as Frank prepared the next round of paperwork, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about law. It was about survival of the soul. The court date was set for a Tuesday morning in late spring. The weeks leading up to it were some of the longest of my life. By day, I hauled lumber and stocked shelves, my muscles screaming from exhaustion. By night, I lay awake in the sagging motel bed, replaying every possible outcome in my mind. Would Emily look at me with the same coldness as the day she shut the door? Or would she flinch, even just a little, when forced to see the man she had cast aside? Frank insisted I focus on preparation. Facts, not feelings, he reminded me, sliding folders of documents across his cluttered desk. Bank records, receipts, witness statements. They'll try to paint you as unstable. We'll counter with proof of your contributions, your work ethic, your standing in the community. Still, at night when the papers were stacked neatly away, the fear crept back in. I wasn't just fighting for dignity in front of strangers. I was bracing to face my daughter again. The child I once carried on my shoulders, who used to cling to my hand crossing the street. Margaret sensed my restlessness. One evening, she found me sitting outside the motel, staring at the sky. She handed me a thermos of hot tea and said, "You're shaking like a leaf." I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out broken. "I don't know if I'm ready to see her." "You don't have to be ready," Margaret replied. "You just have to show up. Sometimes that's all the strength you need. Standing there, refusing to disappear. Her words settled in me like a stone, grounding me. The morning of the hearing, I wore the cleanest shirt I owned, a pale blue button-up Margaret had ironed for me. My hands still trembled as I knotted the tie Ron had lent me. He clapped me on the shoulder before I left for the courthouse. "Go show him what you're made of, old man." The courthouse itself was cold and sterile, its marble floors echoing every step like a judgment. I sat beside Frank, clutching my notebook in my lap like a shield. My heart pounded so loudly I thought the bailiff might hear it. Then the doors opened. Emily walked in. She looked older than I remembered, her hair tied neatly back, a blazer stiff on her shoulders. Beside her was Mark, his hand resting smugly on her arm. My throat closed. For a fleeting second, her eyes met mine. There was no warmth, no flicker of recognition, just a hard, practiced stare. It felt like being erased all over again. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lily. She sat with a babysitter at the back, her little hands clutching a stuffed bunny. When her gaze found me, her eyes widened in surprise. She tugged on the sitter's sleeve, pointing at me, her mouth forming one word I could almost hear despite the distance. "Grandpa." My heart nearly broke open. Frank leaned close, his voice low but steady. "Remember what I told you. Facts, not feelings. Stay calm. You've already won more than you think. You're here. They can't silence that." As the judge entered and everyone rose to their feet, I forced my spine straight. My knees shook, but I locked them tight. I wasn't just a forgotten old man anymore. I was a grandfather reclaiming his voice. And this was only the beginning. The courtroom air was heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of judgment. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Frank, my palms damp against the polished wood. Across from me, Mark whispered something into Emily's ear. She nodded stiffly, never looking in my direction. When the judge called the session to order, Mark's lawyer wasted no time. He stood, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, and began painting me as a burden. "Your Honor, this man has been financially irresponsible for years. My clients took him into their home out of compassion, but he disrupted their household, refused to contribute meaningfully, and created an unstable environment for their child. Eventually, they had no choice but to ask him to leave." Each word was a knife. My jaw tightened, my nails dug into my notebook. Lies. Twisted half-truths. Frank rose calmly when it was our turn. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a matter of compassion gone wrong. It's exploitation. Mr. Miller," he gestured toward me, using the Americanized surname Frank suggested, "paid bills, repaired damages in the house, provided childcare, and gave every ounce of energy to supporting his daughter and her family. And when his usefulness ran out, he was discarded like garbage." The word discarded echoed through the room. The judge's gaze shifted toward Emily and Mark, but before their lawyer could rebut, Frank called his first witness. I nearly gasped when Margaret stepped forward. Dressed neatly, her silver hair pinned back, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "I've known Mr. Miller for months," she said firmly. "He's honest, hardworking, and kind. I've seen him repair half the neighborhood's homes without asking for a dime more than he needed to eat. That is not the behavior of a man unstable or irresponsible." Then Claire appeared, holding her son's hand. She testified about how I fixed his bike, how her boy beamed for days afterward. "He's become like a grandfather to my child," she told the court, her voice trembling. "The kind of man who gives, not takes." Even Ron showed up, rough around the edges as always, but his voice carried authority. "Old man Miller works harder than my 20-year-olds. He's never asked for favors. If anything, he's taught the kids at the store what real work looks like." Each testimony chipped away at the picture Mark's lawyer had painted. I watched Emily's face tighten, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Mark, however, scowled deeper, whispering furiously to his attorney. When it was over, the judge leaned back in his chair. "I see conflicting narratives here. But one thing is clear. This man is not without support. His character speaks loudly through the voices of those who know him." My throat tightened. For months, I had felt invisible. And now, in front of my daughter, I wasn't just seen, I was defended. But the battle was far from won. The judge scheduled further hearings, reminding us this was only the beginning of a long process. Still, as I left the courtroom, Margaret squeezed my arm, and Claire's boy waved at me, grinning wide. For the first time since being thrown out, I walked past Emily and Mark with my head high. And though Emily's eyes still held coldness, I caught the faintest flicker of doubt, as if for just a moment, she wondered if she had underestimated me. For days after the hearing, I walked taller. The testimonies from Margaret, Claire, and Ron had wrapped around me like armor. For the first time in months, I felt less like a discarded shadow and more like a man reclaiming his place in the world. But Mark wasn't finished. Men like him never stop when they feel their control slipping. It began with whispers. At the diner, I noticed conversations quieting as I walked in. A neighbor I'd repaired a roof for avoided my gaze. Margaret heard it first at the market. Mark had started spreading stories. He's unstable. Mark told anyone who'd listen. Dangerous. Shouldn't be trusted around kids. The lies crawled through the community like rot. Some people ignored them. Others pulled back, wary now of the old man living at the motel. The worst came when Claire found me one afternoon, her face pale. I don't want to believe it, she said, wringing her hands. But people are saying, you used to drink too much. That you hit your wife. The words hit harder than any punch. My late wife, God rest her soul, had been my partner, my best friend. I'd never raised a hand to her. I clenched my fists so tightly my knuckles turned white. Frank warned me this would happen. Smear campaigns are common, he said, flipping through his notes. They'll try to bait you into anger. Don't let them. Truth isn't loud, but it lasts. Still, the rage boiled inside me. At night, in the silence of my motel room, I imagined storming to Emily's house, shouting until the lies cracked under the weight of my voice. But then I thought of Lily. Her wide, innocent eyes in the courtroom. If I lost control, if I gave Mark proof of his accusations, I'd lose her forever. So I swallowed my pride and stayed steady. I doubled down on my work. When neighbors hesitated to call me, I knocked on their doors myself. Need a hand with that fence? I'll fix it cheap. Some still trusted me. Others wavered. But every nail I drove, every hinge I repaired, was proof. Not for them, but for me. That Mark's lies couldn't erase who I was. Margaret never faltered. She stood beside me at the diner, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. I've seen this man give away more than he's ever kept. Anyone who says different is lying. Her loyalty was a lifeline, but the loneliness crept in all the same. Walking through town, I felt eyes on my back, whispers trailing like shadows. One night, I opened my notebook and scrawled across a blank page in shaky letters. They want me broken. I will not break. The next hearing was weeks away. The battle lines were drawn tighter now, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. And as much as it tore at me, I knew this was only the beginning of Mark's war. But he underestimated one thing. I'd been underestimated all my life. And men like me don't quit. The whispers hadn't stopped, but neither had I. Each day I worked, saved, and prepared, waiting for the next time I'd face them in court. Frank kept telling me, cases turn not on noise, but on proof. I clung to those words like a rope. Then, one quiet Sunday, proof came. I was fixing the back door of the market when Margaret walked in holding a manila folder. She placed it on the counter with a heavy sigh. You need to see this. Inside were copies of receipts and bank statements. She explained that her cousin worked at the credit union where Mark and Emily kept their joint account. The cousin, who had overheard gossip about the case, passed along something troubling. Large withdrawals from Emily's savings, amounts too big to ignore. Thousands of dollars spent at casinos and high-end electronics stores, all in Mark's name. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. He's been draining her, I muttered, using her money while painting me as the burden. Margaret's eyes were firm. This is your leverage. This shows the court who he really is. Frank nearly jumped out of his chair when I handed him the folder that evening. This changes everything, he said, flipping through the pages. Financial misconduct on his part undermines their entire argument. We'll subpoena official records to make it airtight. If Mark's been siphoning funds, the judge won't look kindly on it, especially while accusing you of being the problem. For the first time, I felt the scales shift. Not in whispers, not in pity, but in hard, undeniable evidence. The next hearing arrived faster than I expected. My hands still trembled as I entered the courtroom, but this time, I wasn't carrying only my shame. I carried the truth. When Frank presented the evidence, the silence in the room was deafening. The judge raised his brows as he scanned the documents. Mark's lawyer stammered, fumbling for explanations. Mark himself turned red. His jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might crack. But it was Emily's face I watched. At first, her eyes widened in disbelief. Then came confusion, darting between Mark and the papers. She whispered something to him, but he didn't look at her. His hands were fists on the table, his gaze fixed forward in fury. For the first time since she'd turned me out, Emily's mask slipped. I saw doubt flicker across her features, as if a seed had been planted, a question she couldn't shake. Had she chosen wrong? When the judge adjourned for the day, I walked out of the courthouse with my chest lifted. For months, I had been fighting shadows. Now, I held a weapon they couldn't ignore. Margaret met me at the steps, her eyes shining. "They're starting to see the truth," she said softly. I nodded, my throat tight. But inside, I was already looking ahead. This wasn't over. The final blow hadn't yet been struck. And when it came, I swore it would leave no doubt. Not for Mark, not for Emily, not for anyone. The final hearing felt heavier than all the others combined. The courthouse buzzed with tension, reporters from the local papers slipping in, neighbors whispering from the benches. This was no longer just a private family dispute. It had become a story people followed, a spectacle of betrayal and truth. I sat with Frank, my notebook tucked into my jacket. My hands trembled, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. Today would decide everything. Mark's lawyer came out swinging, trying to discredit the financial records. "Your Honor, these are taken out of context. My client made withdrawals with full transparency to his wife. There is no wrongdoing here." But when the subpoenaed bank officials confirmed that the funds had been drained into Mark's personal account, not household expenses, the courtroom shifted. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Emily's face went pale. Frank rose slowly, his voice steady but sharp. "Your Honor, the defense has accused my client of being a burden, of destabilizing a home. Yet here we see who truly drained resources, who exploited the trust of his family. Mr. Miller gave his labor, his pension, his heart, and was repaid with cruelty. If this court is to weigh character, let us be clear where the balance lies." The judge's gaze fell on Mark, who sat rigid, jaw tight, sweat beading on his forehead. Then Emily stood. Her lawyer hadn't called her to testify, but the judge allowed it. She walked to the stand, her heels clicking against the tile like gunshots. At first, her words were halting. I believe my husband. I thought my father was a burden. I thought pushing him out was the right thing for my family." Her voice cracked, and for the first time in years, I saw tears fill her eyes. She turned, and our eyes met. "But I was wrong," she said, louder now, as if each syllable burned. "He raised me alone after my mother died. He sacrificed everything so I could have a life. And when I should have stood by him, I turned away. I see now that the man I should have doubted wasn't my father, it was my husband." The courtroom gasped. Mark slammed his fist against the table, shouting, "Emily, don't do this." But the damage was done. The judge silenced the room with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Enough. I've heard more than enough." He shuffled the papers, his voice stern. "It is clear that Mr. Miller was wrongfully cast out and slandered. While this court cannot mend the personal wounds, it can affirm his dignity and his rights as a grandfather. This case is resolved in his favor." The words washed over me like rain after a drought. My knees nearly buckled, but I stood tall. When the session ended, Emily approached me, her face streaked with tears. She whispered, barely audible, "Dad, I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to try." I looked at her, at the daughter I had lost and, perhaps, was beginning to regain. My throat ached, but I managed to say, "We'll start with the truth. That's enough for now." At the back of the courtroom, Lily broke free from her sitter and ran to me, her little arms wrapping around my waist. "Grandpa," she cried, her voice clear and innocent, untainted by lies. Tears blurred my vision as I held her close. For all the pain, for all the nights on the bench, for all the whispers and humiliation, this moment made it worth it. I hadn't just survived. I had reclaimed my place. And as I left the courthouse with Lily's small hand in mine, I whispered the words I had carried in silence for months. They kicked me out. They threw me away. But I came back, and they'll never forget it.